Long before the first kings carved their names into stone, before the rise of empires and the slow march of history as we know it, there was a time when the world was far older, far stranger, and far more alive than modern memory allows. The land that would later be called Mesopotamia was a vast plain of shifting rivers and fertile darkness, a place where the night sky hung low enough to feel like a ceiling of stars pressed against the earth. In this early world, the Sumerians emerged not as simple farmers or wandering tribes, but as a people who carried stories too ancient to be born from a civilization so young. Their earliest tablets hint at memories that predate their own origins, memories whispered through clay and symbols that seem almost too advanced for the age that produced them. It is here, in these tablets, that the first threads of forbidden history begin to unravel. The story does not start with kings or wars or cities rising from the mud. It begins with silence, a silence so deep that only the oldest myths can speak through it. According to their earliest writings, the Sumerians believed they did not invent knowledge. They recovered it. They spoke of celestial teachers, of beings whose footsteps left impressions deeper than the soil of the floodplains, of a world reshaped by forces that came before humanity learned to measure time. These tales were not written like legends or bedtime myths. They were documented with the precision of scribes who believed they were preserving facts. And if these accounts are to be believed, humanity's beginning was not a slow climb from ignorance, but a sudden illumination. Yet these are not the stories taught in schools or found in ordinary museum displays. Many of the most revealing tablets were unearthed only to disappear into private collections, academic vaults, or restricted archives where their translations would gather dust. The fragments that remain accessible to the public hint at something extraordinary, something unsettling, a version of human origin that challenges the linear simplicity of traditional timelines. Some inscriptions describe a world in which knowledge was not discovered but bestowed, technologies not invented but inherited, and civilizations not born but restarted after an earlier age fell into oblivion. The tablets speak of a moment when the earth was different, when the boundary between sky and soil felt thin, and when mysterious beings walked among the early people not as distant gods, but as tangible presences. These beings were not described with wings or halos or the metaphors of later religious tradition. They were depicted with tools, with craft, with specific knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, and architecture that should not have existed in the cradle of early humanity. Their names, titles, and functions were etched into clay with such consistency across cities separated by distance and time that coincidence becomes difficult to accept. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these tablets is not what they describe, but what they omit. Entire passages are broken, lines cut abruptly, symbols chiseled away with a precision that suggests intentional removal rather than the simple wear of time. It is as though someone, long after the Sumerians themselves, attempted to censor portions of their own history. Certain sequences that might have explained the arrival of these beings, or the world that came before the flood, are missing. Other fragments hint at knowledge that was once common but later forbidden, locked away behind layers of interpretation and selective translation. In recent years, researchers, translators, and independent scholars have begun to reassemble the scattered pieces of this ancient puzzle. They have noticed patterns in the omissions, recurring absences in the record that form a shape of their own. The missing passages seem to align with references to events before the flood, to celestial origins, to cycles of destruction and renewal that appear in myths across the globe. The implication is clear. The Sumerians may have known far more about humanity's true beginnings than modern history has allowed us to believe. As we begin this journey into the oldest surviving texts of the ancient world, we must step carefully into the space between what was written and what was erased. The Sumerians left behind a legacy carved in clay, but clay can be shattered, buried, or rewritten. To understand what their tablets are truly trying to say, we must listen to the echoes around the missing pieces as much as to the words that survived. For this is not merely the story of an early civilization. It is the shadow of a forgotten chapter in humanity's origins, one that the tablets seem desperate to reveal, even through their silence. But the first true revelation comes not from the myths themselves, but from the moment the tablets were pulled from the earth and the modern world realized what had been hidden beneath the sand. And what followed next would set the stage for everything this ancient record was trying to tell. The first tablets emerged not from royal libraries or temple vaults, but from beneath layers of soil that had forgotten their own memories. Archaeologists described the moment with reverence, as though they had awakened something that had been waiting patiently for thousands of years. The clay was cool to the touch, preserved by time, and each symbol etched into its surface seemed too deliberate, too precise, to belong to a civilization so distant in the past. The discovery was accidental, a simple excavation, yet it marked the beginning of a quiet revolution. These tablets were unlike the administrative records or agricultural tallies typically found in early sites. They carried a different weight, as if written by hands aware they were documenting more than their own era. And as the dust settled and the symbols were cleaned, a strange unease spread across the team. Something about these inscriptions felt older than the civilization they supposedly belonged to. The earliest translation attempts were cautious. Scholars expected to uncover stories of early kings, perhaps references to the flood or the rise of cities along the rivers. Instead, they found descriptions of a time before those kings, before those rivers even carved their paths through the land. The tablet spoke of an age of great brightness, when the sky was crowded with unfamiliar lights and humanity was not yet separate from the beings that guided them. The tone of the text was not mythic, but matter-of-fact, as though the scribes were recording historical events rather than spiritual allegories. This unusual clarity raised questions that pushed beyond traditional frameworks. How could a people so ancient describe celestial mechanics with such confidence? How could the earliest writing system already contain terminology that seemed refined, structured, inherited? Some scholars dismissed these anomalies as metaphorical exaggerations. Others proposed that the tablets were misdated or misinterpreted. But a small number recognized something different, an undercurrent of memory running through the text, a sense that the Sumerians were not inventing a narrative, but recalling fragments of a period older than their own. When these minority voices attempted to publish their interpretations, they encountered resistance, not outright denial, but a slow constriction, as though invisible hands were steering the conversation toward more conventional conclusions. References to celestial visitors were reclassified as symbolic. Mentions of advanced structures became poetic imagination. Entire sections of translations were quietly revised to fit accepted norms, yet the tablets themselves remained unchanged. As more artifacts were uncovered from different regions, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, the same patterns appeared. Across cities separated by distance, the narrative fragments aligned too precisely to be coincidence. They described beings whose count of years was beyond measure, beings who shaped the clay of life, beings who departed when the heavens opened, leaving humanity to inherit a world reshaped by forces no longer present. These accounts did not present themselves as myths explaining natural phenomena. They read like brief reports of interactions, records of encounters, memories of a relationship between early humanity and something otherworldly. Among the most startling discoveries were tablets that seemed to reference structures no longer found in Mesopotamia. Massive stepped platforms, towers that hummed with power, and chambers that required knowledge of geometry far beyond what the Sumerians were supposed to have mastered. Some scholars suggested these were descriptions of the earliest ziggurats, but the details did not match. The tablets referenced materials that did not belong to the region, techniques that would not emerge for centuries, and mechanisms that implied an understanding of energy and resonance foreign to the ancient world. These references were often dismissed as lost metaphors, yet their consistency across sites made metaphor seem like a fragile explanation. As more tablets surfaced, patterns in the erasures became just as significant as the surviving text. Entire lines were scratched out with deliberate care, symbols gouged from the clay, as if someone had attempted to remove knowledge rather than preserve it. This was not the erosion of time, it was editing. The precision of the damage suggested it occurred not long after the tablets were made, perhaps even within a generation of their creation. But why would a civilization erase its own earliest memories? What danger did these inscriptions pose to the world that came after? The answer may lie in the final lines of several partially damaged tablets. These fragments speak of the parting, of a moment when the beings who guided humanity withdrew suddenly, leaving the early people in a world that had changed too quickly for them to comprehend. The tone shifts from calm record to urgency, as though the scribes were preserving the last moments of an era before a great rupture. It is here, in these desperate lines, that the first hints of conflict, of catastrophe, of cosmic imbalance emerge. But they stop abruptly, as if cut short. What happened during this parting? Why did the ancient record falter just when the story became most critical? And why do echoes of this event appear in myths from every corner of the world, as though humanity once shared a collective memory that fractured into regional legends after its origin was forgotten? To understand this, we must look beyond the tablets themselves and into the physical world the Sumerians inherited, a world that bore the scars of a past they tried to document before. Time or someone else could erase it. And the first clue lies in the land beneath their feet, a land shaped not only by rivers, but by something far more ancient. Long before the Sumerians carved their first symbols into wet clay, something else had shaped the land they would one day call home. Modern geology speaks of shifting rivers, tectonic tremors, and natural erosion. But the ancient tablets, those untouched by erasure, hint at forces that cannot be explained by the ordinary rhythms of Earth. They describe a world before the world, a landscape of vast plateaus, gleaming structures, and radiant towers that stretch toward a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. Whether these accounts recall literal memories or metaphorical impressions, the question remains. Why does the earliest writing in human history speak so confidently of an age that predates the dawn of civilization? Excavations across Mesopotamia reveal hints of an older substrate beneath the cities, buried foundations constructed from stone types not native to the region, arranged with a precision that suggests engineering far more advanced than the mud brick architecture of early Sumer. Archaeologists often classify these finds as remnants of unknown pre-pottery cultures. Yet the style, symmetry, and sheer scale of some of these foundations raise unsettling questions. The Sumerians themselves referred to certain ancient structures as the houses built before the kings, describing them as ruins inherited from beings who no longer walk the earth. These beings, the tablets claim, departed to the upper realms, leaving behind architecture that the earliest humans scarcely understood. One pattern becomes especially difficult to explain: the alignment of certain buried structures with celestial points that match the sky not of the Sumerian age, but of thousands of years earlier. Some foundations align with the heliacal rising of specific stars, whose positions correspond to a prehistoric epoch. For a civilization that should not yet have mastered advanced astronomy, such precision seems impossible unless they inherited these alignments from a culture that came before. Mainstream academia acknowledges the unusual alignments, but attributes them to coincidence or later reconstruction. Yet several tablets indicate that the Sumerians believed these structures were set by those who measured the heavens, implying a knowledge system older than human memory. As excavators studied these ruins, they noticed another anomaly. Certain layers of sediment displayed signs of sudden compression, as if a massive weight had pressed down upon the land in an instant. In some areas, the soil appears to have been liquefied and then hardened again, trapping objects within it in patterns that defy natural flooding or earthquake activity. This has led some researchers to connect these findings with the ancient catastrophe narratives found not only in Sumer but across cultures, stories of a great upheaval that reshaped the world, burying cities, altering rivers, and forcing survivors into new regions. The Sumerians, in their earliest texts, spoke openly of a shattering of the heavens and a time when the firmament groaned. Later, scribes softened these descriptions into mythic metaphors, but the oldest references suggest something violent and world-shifting occurred before the rise of civilization. They described the bright towers falling, the roar that split the sky, and the waters rising from the deep. These accounts correlate with geological signs of abrupt changes, although scientists attribute the shifts to climatic events at the end of the last ice age. Yet what if the Sumerian scribes were documenting not a natural disaster, but the aftermath of an event involving beings whose presence and departure left physical marks upon the earth? These early inhabitants seemed aware that they were living in the shadow of forgotten power. They built their first temples atop the ruins of older foundations, sometimes preserving the shape of the structures without understanding their function. In several sites, archaeologists found ceremonial chambers built around massive stone blocks that served no architectural purpose for the Sumerians. It was as though the new civilization treated the remnants of the old as sacred relics, too important to remove, yet too enigmatic to replicate. In the surviving texts, a term appears repeatedly: Anshalu, the forgotten makers. The exact meaning remains debated, but some linguists propose it refers to beings or architects from an older age. The tablets describe the Anshalu as those who shaped the world and then stepped beyond the horizon. Whether these were mythic ancestors, divine entities, or real individuals lost to time, their presence loomed over early Sumerian consciousness. The new humans felt both indebted to and estranged from these predecessors, living among ruins they inherited but did not comprehend. As the Sumerians rebuilt over these foundations, they tried to recreate the techniques of the older world, but their attempts fell short. Their mud brick structures crumbled within centuries, while the ancient stone foundations endured millennia. The contrast between these materials symbolizes a deeper truth embedded in the tablets. The Sumerians were heirs to knowledge they could not fully grasp, custodians of memories they preserved without understanding. This sense of incompleteness, of standing on the remnants of a forgotten age, infused early Sumer with both fascination and unease. They believed they were living in the aftermath of a rupture so profound that even the gods behaved differently afterward. And it is in these foundational mysteries that we find the first clues pointing toward the arrival of the Anunnaki themselves, not as distant myths, but as beings whose presence was once tangible. To understand what the Sumerians truly believed about these beings, we must follow the traces left in their earliest myths, traces that describe not divine metaphors, but encounters that feel startlingly direct. The earliest myths of Sumer do not begin with creation, they begin with arrival. This alone sets them apart from nearly every other ancient tradition. Where other civilizations describe gods emerging from primordial chaos, the Sumerians speak of beings who came down to a world already formed, beings who descended to shape it, rule it, and reorder its destiny. These accounts appear not in the later, more poetic hymns, but in the oldest administrative tablets, written in the matter-of-fact tone of chroniclers recording events rather than inventing legends. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not distant symbols. They were rulers, teachers, and architects. present forces who influenced the earliest chapters of human development. One of the earliest surviving texts describes a moment known as the landing of the Great Ones, recorded with surprising precision. The tablet speaks of a trembling in the heavens, a brilliance that turned night into noon, and a column of wind that descended upon a plain near Eridu. These details have been dismissed as mythic embellishment, yet their structure feels different. Repetitive, observational, almost clinical. They read less like metaphor and more like an attempt to capture an event beyond the scribe's comprehension. The story continues by describing beings who stepped forth in shining garments, radiating the light of a star, language that scholars interpret symbolically. But the consistency of the imagery across tablets, separated by centuries, hints at a shared cultural memory of something sensory and dramatic. What makes these accounts even more unusual is their portrayal of the Anunnaki as a structured assembly. They arrive in groups, each bearing rank and responsibility. The texts refer to them as the 7 who decree, the 50 who descend, and the hosts who establish order. Their leader, often named Anu or Enlil depending on the period, is described not as an ethereal deity, but as a commanding presence, issuing directives and assigning territories. These depictions blur the boundary between divine myth and historical record, suggesting that the Sumerians viewed their gods less as abstract forces and more as powerful beings who operated within an organized hierarchy. A recurring phrase appears in multiple tablets. They measured the earth with cords of the heavens. This enigmatic line has been interpreted as poetic imagery of divine surveying. Yet some researchers have noticed that the description aligns with early Mesopotamian practices of astronomical triangulation. Could this phrase represent a memory of the Anunnaki mapping the land using celestial reference points? The precision of early Sumerian city layouts, aligned with specific stars, solstices, and lunar stations, suggests knowledge far exceeding what humans of that era should have possessed. If this knowledge was inherited from these beings, the phrase may be less symbolic than it appears. The Sumerians also record the establishment of the first cities as deliberate acts, directed by the Anunnaki themselves. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and Bad Tibira are described not simply as human settlements, but as stations of the gods, built according to instructions provided from above. One tablet states, "Where they rested their feet, a city rose." The implication is striking. The earliest cities were not spontaneous developments of human society, but purposeful constructions designed for interaction between humanity and these arriving beings. This runs contrary to the mainstream narrative of gradual urban evolution. Yet the archaeological record supports the notion that Sumer's earliest cities appear fully formed, without clear developmental precursors. Their sudden sophistication mirrors the sudden appearance of writing, administration, and complex religious systems. Even more compelling is the way the tablets describe human involvement in these early projects. Humanity is portrayed not as passive observers, but as active participants trained by the Anunnaki. They are taught irrigation, brick-making, metallurgy, and timekeeping. But the tone of these accounts is revealing. The lessons are not framed as divine inspiration, but as technical instruction. The gods teach humans the counting of the stars, the mixing of metals, and the writing of signs. In this light, the Anunnaki resemble mentors or overseers rather than untouchable cosmic beings. The dynamic is closer to teacher and apprentice than god and worshipper. Perhaps the most provocative detail appears in a fragment describing the establishment of Nippur. It states that the Anunnaki built a structure referred to as the eknum, translated by some as control house or measuring house. The description is vague, but it mentions devices that hummed like bees and lights that did not flicker. These lines are typically dismissed as mistranslations or scribal flourishes, yet the specificity of the imagery is difficult to ignore. If metaphorical, it is unusually technical. If literal, it suggests the presence of technology interpreted through the limited vocabulary of early humanity. The Sumerians accepted all of this without question because, from their perspective, the Anunnaki were not distant myths. They were real presences, whose arrival marked the beginning of recorded history. The scribes make no attempt to elevate these beings into pure metaphor. Instead, they describe interactions, conversations, instructions, disagreements. The gods debate among themselves about how to organize humanity, how to divide the lands, and how to respond to human behavior. These narratives feel less like mythology and more like chronicles of a ruling elite whose decisions shaped the earliest civilizations. This raises the central question: if the Anunnaki truly interacted with early humans in such direct ways, what was their purpose? The tablets offer clues, but none are more intriguing or more unsettling than the accounts that describe the creation and modification of humanity itself. To understand what the Sumerians believed about their origins, we must examine the most controversial texts ever found in Mesopotamia, the creation tablets that hint at a forbidden truth. The creation tablets of ancient Sumer begin not with the origin of the universe, but with a problem. The Anunnaki, according to the earliest accounts, faced a world that was inhospitable, demanding, and labor-intensive. They carved irrigation channels, dredged riverbeds, quarried stone, and shaped the land. Work described as exhausting even for these powerful beings. The tablets say bluntly, "The toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much." This simple statement becomes the spark for one of the most unsettling narratives in human antiquity: the creation of humanity not as a miracle, but as a solution. The most controversial tablet, often associated with the Enki and Ninmah narrative, describes a council of the Anunnaki debating how to relieve themselves of their burdens. The idea arises to fashion a new being, one capable of taking over the labor that had become intolerable. Scholars typically interpret this as mythic symbolism, reflecting agricultural dependence. But the language used is strikingly technical. The gods discuss mixing the essence of one with the form of another, binding the image of the gods upon a creature of earth, and shaping a body to accept instruction. These phrases resemble descriptions of biological engineering far more than poetic myth. At the center of this story stands Enki, the god of wisdom, crafts, and deep knowledge. He proposes a daring experiment: to take a creature already living on Earth and alter it so that it might contain the signs of the gods. The creature is described as of clay, a metaphor scholars attribute to the Earth itself. Yet in other parts of the text, this being is portrayed as wild, noisy, and incapable of structured thought. Modern readers cannot help noticing the resemblance to early hominins. Whether symbolic or literal, the narrative presents humanity as a hybrid, part earthly, part divine. The process of creation unfolds in a way that feels unusually sequential. The gods attempt multiple prototypes. One is blind, another is unable to stand, a third is unable to reproduce. The trial and error nature of these attempts has puzzled scholars for decades. Why would a myth describe failed creations? Why include details of malformed beings unless they were echoing a tradition that once meant something concrete? Myths are typically polished. Creation stories tend to be triumphant. Yet here we see an experimental process, one that acknowledges mistakes and corrections. Eventually, the creation succeeds. A being is formed that can think, speak, and labor. The Anunnaki rejoice, not because they have created life, but because their burden is lifted. The tablet states, "The new ones took up the toil. The gods were freed." Humanity's purpose, in its earliest written description, is not exalted, it is utilitarian. This inversion of typical creation narratives has led modern researchers to re-examine the Sumerian worldview. Were the Sumerians preserving a memory of real interactions with advanced beings? Or was this myth an expression of the agricultural revolution that reshaped human society? Yet the story does not end with human creation. Another puzzle emerges: the sudden and dramatic expansion of human capability described in the tablets. After humanity is formed, the gods begin to teach. They instruct humans in planting, metallurgy, writing, building, healing, and divination. These are not abstract gifts. They are described as structured knowledge, delivered step by step. In one tablet, Enki opens the mouth of understanding, a phrase interpreted by some scholars as the introduction of language or symbolic reasoning. The Sumerians themselves believed that their knowledge did not originate with them. It was given, taught, or restored. This teaching period matches the archaeological record in uncanny ways. Around 3500 BCE, Sumerian civilization appears almost fully formed. Writing, city planning, irrigation, mathematics, and astronomy emerge within a short span, too quickly, many argue, to reflect gradual human development. Mainstream scholars attribute this leap to cultural diffusion and environmental opportunity. Yet the Sumerians insist the opposite. They inherited their knowledge. The creation tablets also contain a hint of tension. Once humans multiply, the gods grow uneasy. The texts describe humans becoming numerous, noisy, and increasingly independent. Some gods advocate for limiting human lifespan. Others push for stricter control. This tension foreshadows later conflicts and culminates in the Great Flood narrative, where the gods attempt to reset humanity altogether. But before that catastrophe, another subtle detail emerges, one that deepens the mystery of humanity's origins. Several tablets mention that the divine essence given to humans was not identical to that of the Anunnaki. It was a reduced form, a limited inheritance. Humans resembled the gods, but lacked their longevity, strength, and deeper knowledge. In one fragment, Enki states, "Let them bear our likeness, but not our power." This line has fueled centuries of speculation. Were the Sumerians hinting at a deliberate constraint placed upon humanity? If so, who imposed it and why? These questions become even more pressing when we examine the next set of tablets, those that describe the fallibility, conflict, and dissent within the Anunnaki themselves. The creation of humanity was not a harmonious act. It was a compromise, a contested decision that exposed deep divisions among the powerful beings who ruled the earliest world. And it is within those divisions that the story of early humanity takes a darker, more dangerous turn. The next block leads us into the internal fractures of the Anunnaki, rifts that would shape the destiny of both gods and humans. The earliest Sumerian tablets portray the Anunnaki not as a unified pantheon, but as a council divided by competing priorities, personal ambitions, and conflicting visions for humanity's role in the world. These fractures are not hidden. If anything, they are emphasized with surprising transparency. Far from infallible deities, the Anunnaki appear as beings capable of error, disagreement, and regret. And it is within these tensions that humanity's early fate was shaped, often in ways that the tablets suggest were never part of the original plan. At the center of these divisions stands Enlil, a figure depicted as stern, authoritative, and deeply concerned with order. As the custodian of earth and air, he oversees the structure of human society, the maintenance of boundaries, and the enforcement of divine law. Enlil views humanity's growing independence as a threat to cosmic balance. In several tablets, he expresses frustration that humans multiplied like insects and disrupted the quiet of the gods. His perspective frames humanity not as a partner, but as a potential destabilizer, a creation that must be monitored and limited. Opposite him stands Enki, the architect of humanity and the god of wisdom. Enki's relationship with humans is fundamentally different. He treats them as apprentices, not tools. While Enlil advocates for restraint, Enki pushes for empowerment. He teaches humans skills that elevate them beyond mere laborers, giving them access to knowledge that approaches the domain of the gods. This conflict, control versus growth, becomes the defining tension in early Sumerian cosmology. The tablets describe multiple instances in which Enki acts covertly to protect or advance humanity against Enlil's restrictions. When Enlil imposes limits on human reproduction, Enki quietly circumvents them. When Enlil attempts to reduce human knowledge, Enki restores what had been lost. These actions are depicted not as rebellion, but as acts of compassion. Yet they expose a deep fissure within the Council of the Anunnaki, a disagreement over what humanity is meant to become. Other powerful figures occupy the spectrum between these extremes. Inanna, the brilliant and unpredictable goddess of power and transformation, oscillates between ambition and empathy. She supports humanity when it aligns with her goals, nurturing cities like Uruk into centers of innovation and influence. Yet she also unleashes chaos when crossed, blurring the boundary between deity and ruler. Her presence in the narrative is volatile, hinting at a pantheon whose decisions were not always rational or harmonious. Ninurta, the warrior son of Enlil, embodies the militant enforcement of divine decree. He appears in tablets describing battles against rebels, both human and divine. His loyalty to Enlil positions him as an enforcer of cosmic law, often putting him at odds with Enki's more permissive philosophies. For the Sumerians, these interactions were not abstract theology. They were political dramas woven into the fabric of the world. The most revealing of the internal conflicts, however, appears in the series of tablets describing the lead-up to the Great Flood. According to these records, the Anunnaki held a council where they debated humanity's future. Enlil argued that humans had become uncontrollable, violating boundaries and consuming resources at an unsustainable pace. His proposed solution was not reform, but elimination. The council wavered. Some agreed, citing concerns about cosmic balance. Others objected, arguing that humanity's progress was a result of divine instruction. Their disagreement mirrors debates modern civilizations still face. Should a flawed creation be corrected or guided? The decision to unleash the flood was not unanimous. The tablets make this clear. Enki opposed the plan but was bound by an oath not to reveal the council's decision. Unable to warn humanity directly, he found a loophole. He whispered the truth to a reed wall, allowing Utnapishtim, hidden nearby, to overhear. This subtle act of defiance preserved the future of the human race. In myths worldwide, a similar pattern emerges: a chosen survivor, a divine warning, and a catastrophic reset. But in the Sumerian version, the survival of humanity hinges not on divine will, but on the descent of a single god. The flood becomes the ultimate symbol of the Anunnaki's fractured governance, an attempt to reset humanity, backed by some gods and resisted by others. And the aftermath of this event reshaped the world in ways even the Anunnaki could not fully predict. The flood did not simply destroy. It exposed deeper instability within the pantheon itself, revealing a council that was losing coherence and authority. The tablets describing the post-flood era reveal a pantheon transformed. Some gods withdrew, others diminished. The direct interaction between humans and the Anunnaki faded. The reasons for this withdrawal are unclear. Some scholars argue that it reflects theological evolution, but the language of the tablets hints at something more abrupt, a departure rather than a gradual distancing. This raises an unsettling possibility. The Anunnaki may not have vanished because humanity no longer needed them, but because they could no longer maintain their presence in a world altered by catastrophe or by their own conflicts. And it is in the next block that we explore this transition. The mysterious disappearance of the Anunnaki from the human world and the fragments of evidence left behind that suggest their departure was far from peaceful. When the floodwaters receded and the world reshaped itself into a quieter, humbler landscape, the Sumerian tablets shift in tone. What had once been a vivid record of divine involvement becomes increasingly distant, fragmented, and subdued. The gods, once described as walking among humans, dining in their temples, issuing commands directly, begin to fade from the narrative. This disappearance is not portrayed as a graceful withdrawal. It is abrupt, somber, and marked by language suggesting strain, loss, and irreversible change. The earliest post-flood tablets describe a world attempting to reorganize itself. Humans rebuild settlements in the shadow of destroyed temples. Kingship is lowered again from the heavens, but this time the process feels less direct, less embodied. Instead of gods appointing rulers face to face, the texts speak of decrees carried on the wind or visions granted in dreams. Scholars interpret this as symbolic storytelling, but the contrast with earlier, more literal descriptions is striking. Something has changed, not merely in belief, but in the perceived accessibility of the divine. One of the most telling accounts appears in a broken tablet from Nippur, which states, "The great gods stood apart. Their voices no longer moved through the cities." A later line adds, "The doors of communication were sealed." These phrases have been glossed over as metaphors for societal transformation. Yet in context, they imply a severed connection, as if the channel through which gods and humans interacted had closed suddenly and perhaps unexpectedly. Another tablet from the post-flood era describes a meeting among the remaining Anunnaki. The tone is weary. Their debates reflect not triumph, but exhaustion. They speak of Earth as burdensome, of their powers diminished, and of a need to retreat to the distant places where time is slow. Mainstream translators soften these lines, suggesting they reflect the gods returning to the heavens in mythic fashion. But the language is curious. Distant places where time is slow evokes something more physical than symbolic. Whether interpreted cosmically, technologically, or metaphysically, the phrasing suggests departure rather than ascension. The disappearance is further marked by the silence of Inanna. Previously one of the most active deities, she dominates pre-flood and early post-flood literature with her interventions, ambitions, and influence over cities like Uruk. Then, suddenly, her presence diminishes. She becomes symbolic rather than personal. Her once vivid exploits turn into ritual hymns and temple chants. It is as though a once-living figure has become a memory, her stories preserved but her presence withdrawn. In the emotional language of laments, scribes write, "She no longer speaks in dreams. She no longer walks in her house." This fading mirrors the fading of the entire pantheon. Perhaps the most haunting clue appears in the lament for Ur, which describes not just the destruction of a city, but the departure of the gods themselves. The lament speaks of ships of heaven lifting off from temple rooftops, accompanied by winds that devoured the dust. Scholars debate the translation, but the original wording is unusually concrete. It does not read like allegory. It reads like observation. If literal, it suggests a physical exodus, remembered through the metaphors available to ancient scribes. Archaeology adds another intriguing layer. Many temples in Sumer show signs of sudden abandonment rather than gradual decline. Items once used for daily ritual, bowls, figurines, seals, appear left in place, as if the inhabitants departed quickly. Burn layers in some sites suggest destruction, while others show no sign of violence at all, only abrupt vacancy. These discrepancies have puzzled archaeologists for decades. Some attribute them to shifting river patterns or political upheaval, yet the pattern aligns eerily with the textual narrative. Gods and their priestly representatives disappearing at once, leaving behind a world unsure how to interpret the silence. The change in kingship is equally revealing. After the flood, kings reign for dramatically shorter periods. Before the flood, reign lengths stretch across centuries or even millennia. Post-flood kings live human lifespans. Scholars interpret the earlier numbers symbolically, but the Sumerians themselves believe the difference was real, marking a transition from an age when gods and semi-divine beings ruled to an age confined to human limits. The tablets frame this shift, not as natural evolution, but as the result of a deliberate decree. Someone altered the rules. Someone severed humanity from the longevity once believed possible. Another tablet describes a final assembly of the Anunnaki, in which they divide humanity into regions, appoint guardians from afar, and leave instructions on maintaining order. Yet the tone is melancholic. It suggests a farewell rather than a strategic delegation of leadership. The gods express uncertainty about humanity's future, acknowledging that they can no longer guide them directly. The phrase, "let them find their own path in the dust," appears repeatedly in later literature, as though crystallizing a grief shared across the pantheon. But the largest mystery remains unresolved. Why did the Anunnaki leave? The tablets offer hints, but no definitive answer. Some suggest internal conflict weakened their ability to remain. Others imply that Earth itself became unstable or hostile. A few fragments hint at the depletion of something essential: resources, energy, or even biological compatibility. One broken line reads, "The world changed beneath our feet. What sustained us was no more." Whatever the cause, the departure of the Anunnaki marks a turning point not just in myth, but in humanity's psychological history. From this moment on, the human world is defined by absence, by the search for memories, for clues, for lost wisdom that once flowed directly from beings no longer present. And it is this search, this attempt to reconnect with what was lost, that leads to the great quests of the ancient world. Journeys born of longing, trauma, and the suspicion that humanity once knew far more than it remembers today. In the centuries that followed the mysterious withdrawal of the Anunnaki, the world entered what the Sumerians describe as an age of wandering. The direct line between gods and humans had been severed, and into that silence poured a growing unease. Something essential had vanished: a presence, a guidance, a connection, leaving humanity with fragments of memory and vast, unanswerable questions. This void did not produce stagnation. Instead, it ignited the earliest great journeys in recorded history. Expeditions driven not by conquest or commerce, but by a desperate need to recover what had been lost. The first of these journeys appears in the Sumerian tales of Enmerkar, the king of Uruk, who led a long, obsessive quest toward a distant land known as Arata. Arata is described as a place of radiant stone, brilliant metals, sacred knowledge, and ancient power, a region that somehow retained remnants of a pre-flood world. Enmerkar's journeys are not framed as exploration, they are framed as retrieval. He seeks materials, rituals, and wisdom no longer found in Sumer. His messengers travel across mountains, deserts, and unknown lands, guided only by stories whispered in temple halls. Traditional scholars interpret these narratives as mythic echoes of early trade routes. Yet the tone of the tablets feels different, urgent, reverent, haunted by the fear that the last threads of ancient knowledge were slipping away. Across these accounts lies the repeated mention of the agreements of old, suggesting that the Sumerians believed they once shared a formal relationship with Arata, a relationship that predated the flood and the disappearance of the gods. Enmerkar invokes Inanna to legitimize his demands, claiming that she once bound Arata and Uruk to a shared destiny. Modern readers often dismiss this as political myth-making, but alternative interpretations view it as cultural memory, a remnant of partnerships formed before the world was reshaped by catastrophe. In this view, Arata becomes less a mythical land and more a surviving shard of an older, forgotten civilization. Another tale speaks of a journey east toward lands described as where the great ones ascended, where the mountains hum, and where the earth hides its deepest memories. These descriptions may be symbolic, but the consistency across tablets is striking. They hint at real locations, regions where early peoples believed remnants of the divine presence still lingered. These journeys were often undertaken by priests, scholars, and kings who sought lost teachings. Their quests frequently ended in failure, but they left behind hints of what they had hoped to find. Archives older than human history, temples aligned with pre-flood stars, and ruins whose construction defied the abilities of the people who now inhabited the land. The most famous of these journeys, however, belongs to Gilgamesh, who embarked on a desperate quest not for wealth or power, but for immortality, a privilege believed to have belonged to humans in the earliest age, before it was taken away. Gilgamesh's path takes him to the edges of the world, through tunnels of silence, across waters of death, and into the presence of beings who exist in the liminal space between mortal and divine. His encounters are filled with riddles, guardians forged by the gods, tavern keepers who speak of vanished eras, and ferrymen who navigate invisible boundaries. Modern scholars often interpret Gilgamesh's story as purely metaphorical, a reflection on human mortality, but the details he encounters feel strangely concrete. He seeks Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood, because he believes that the pre-flood world held secrets now locked away. Gilgamesh's despair at being denied immortality mirrors the Sumerian belief that the flood was not merely a natural disaster, but a reset that severed humanity's connection to longevity, knowledge, and the presence of the gods. In this sense, Gilgamesh's journey becomes a symbolic representation of the human condition after the departure of the Anunnaki, a search for truths just beyond reach. Outside of mythic tales, archaeological evidence reveals a similar pattern. Ancient peoples embarked on long-distance expeditions to obtain materials or knowledge whose origins they did not fully understand. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, diorite from Oman, and rare metals from distant mountains appear in regions where no local sources exist. Some scholars attribute this to early trade networks. Others suggest that these journeys represent attempts to reconnect with places once associated with divine presence or lost technology. The Sumerians themselves frequently refer to distant lands as the homes of the seven, the resting places of old kings, or where the plans of heaven remain hidden. These quests reveal a civilizational psyche shaped by trauma, not merely of the flood, but of abandonment. Humanity had once lived in the shadow of beings who shaped their world, guided their cities, and taught them the foundations of civilization. When those beings withdrew, they left behind ruins and rituals, but not the understanding required to maintain them. The result was a world driven by longing, a desire to restore a connection that had been broken. And it is at the edge of these quests that a new figure emerges in the tablets, the keeper of secrets, a being or human who bridges the divide between the pre-flood and post-flood ages. This figure stands as the last witness of the old world, the final repository of knowledge that humanity is no longer permitted to hold openly. In the next block, we will explore this elusive figure, the one who carries the forbidden memories of humanity's true origins, the one whose silence marks the boundary between myth and reality. For every civilization that rises from the ruins of an older world, there is always one figure who stands between what was lost and what must never be spoken again. In Sumerian tradition, this figure is known by many names: the keeper of secrets, the witness of ages, the one who remembers before the waters. Scholars typically dismiss these titles as poetic inventions, mythic flourishes added by scribes. Yet their presence across multiple tablets spanning centuries and cities suggests something far more intentional. It is as if the ancient scribes wanted to preserve the memory of a single entity, human or otherwise, who held knowledge too dangerous to record directly. This mysterious figure appears in the earliest layers of Sumerian literature, often at transitional moments when the narrative shifts from mythic events to historical kings. His presence is subtle, a brief mention in a lineage, a fragment of dialogue, a hint that someone was there before the flood and remained for a time after. Some tablets call him Ziusudra, others Utnapishtim, others simply refer to him as the one chosen to live. Traditional scholars treat these names as interchangeable, mythic stand-ins for a single flood survivor. But a closer reading suggests something more complicated. The possibility that the Sumerians believed a real individual, or perhaps a lineage of individuals, carried forbidden knowledge from one age into the next. The most striking theme associated with the keeper is memory. The tablets repeatedly emphasize that he remembers the world before the deluge, a world in which humans lived closer to the gods, possessed greater understanding, and witnessed events modern readers would interpret as impossible. When Gilgamesh seeks immortality, he is told that only the keeper knows the truth behind life, death, and the transformation of humanity. When ancient priests perform rituals, they invoke the keeper as the guardian of the plans of heaven, suggesting that certain technologies or instructions once existed but were lost after the flood reshaped the world. Even more intriguing is the keeper's association with the tablets of destiny, powerful objects said to determine the fate of both gods and humans. Some versions of the myth describe the tablets as cosmic symbols, while others depict them as literal artifacts, inscribed stone or metal plates that contain laws of nature, astronomical knowledge, and instructions for navigating realms beyond the physical. The fact that the keeper is repeatedly linked to these tablets raises a fascinating possibility that he served as the last custodian of advanced knowledge inherited from the Anunnaki. Yet the tablets emphasize another theme as well, the keeper's silence. According to the texts, after the flood, the gods command him to withdraw from the world, to avoid spreading the knowledge he carries, and to allow humanity to rebuild on its own. This enforced silence hints at a troubling idea, that humanity's access to ancient knowledge was deliberately restricted. Whether to protect humans or to prevent them from becoming rivals to the gods, the result was the same, a world rebuilt without memory. But not all traces of the keeper were erased. In several fragments, scribes describe a house of writing, hidden far from the great cities, a place where ancient knowledge was stored after the flood. The location is never revealed, but the descriptions evoke a mountain fortress, a cave illuminated by a strange light, or a remote shrine where the wisdom of before was kept sealed. Some historians treat this as symbolic of forgotten archives. Others speculate that it refers to a real place, perhaps an early prototype of what later cultures would call the Hall of Records, the Library of Kings, or the House of Thoth. What makes this figure especially compelling for our story is not simply his connection to the past, but the way he bridges the gap between myth and history. After his final appearance, early Sumerian records undergo a dramatic shift. Kingship becomes more human-centered, the gods intervene less directly, and the tone of the tablets changes from cosmic drama to administrative record-keeping. It's as if the keeper's departure marks the moment humanity is left to govern itself, cut off from the beings who shaped its earliest development. Yet echoes of this figure continue to reappear in later civilizations. In Akkadian myths, he becomes Atrahasis, the wise survivor warned of the flood by a god who regretted humanity's destruction. In Hebrew tradition, he becomes Noah, keeper of life through catastrophe. In ancient Iranian stories, he appears as Yima, ruler of a paradise sealed underground before a world-ending winter. And in obscure Gnostic texts, he takes the form of a guardian who preserves knowledge from one cosmic cycle to the next. Across these traditions, the same pattern persists. A figure who witnesses a reset, survives a cataclysm, preserves forbidden knowledge, and withdraws from the world at the command of higher powers. The Sumerians understood this figure not as a myth, but as a boundary, the last connection to a world that no longer existed. And here lies the quiet tragedy. The keeper of secrets is not celebrated as a hero. He is mourned. The tablets describe him as the last of the old ones, the one who walks away, the last to remember. His story marks the end of an era in which humanity lived under the guidance of beings who shaped their destiny. After his disappearance, the humans of the New Age struggled to rebuild without the clarity, longevity, or understanding they once possessed. In the next block, we will follow the path the keeper leaves behind, the trail of fragments, broken tablets, and forbidden memories that point toward what early humanity truly lost when the gods departed. When the keeper disappears from the written record, the world of the Sumerians undergoes a quiet transformation, gradual enough that most scribes never comment on it directly, yet profound enough to reshape the entire arc of early human civilization. It is in these subtle shifts, buried between lines of cuneiform, that the first cracks in the official narrative begin to appear. These cracks hint at a past far older, far more complex, and far more advanced than the historical timeline we are handed today. The earliest Sumerian tablets describe a world overflowing with divine presence, gods walking among humans, imparting knowledge, establishing cities, and teaching skills that appear abruptly, without any precursor. Agriculture, irrigation, writing, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, each emerges in a form that suggests refinement rather than invention. Scholars explain this as cultural diffusion or sudden innovation, but the tablets themselves tell a different story. They attribute these gifts explicitly to the Anunnaki, described not as abstract deities, but as beings who interacted physically with humans, establishing a civilization that bloomed almost overnight. Yet as soon as the keeper vanishes, the tone of the records shifts dramatically. The Anunnaki withdraw into the heavens. Their temples become ceremonial rather than functional. Their presence becomes symbolic rather than literal. And the cities once said to be built under their direct guidance begin to record mundane matters: grain rations, livestock counts, market inventories, and disputes between farmers. The contrast is stark and unnatural. It is as if an entire world of direct contact with powerful beings was suddenly replaced by a purely human struggle to maintain what had been left behind. Some historians argue that this transition reflects nothing more than myth giving way to practical administration, but the tablets complicate that explanation. Many scribes in later centuries write with a kind of grief, a sense of distance from an age they themselves never witnessed, but somehow felt had slipped through humanity's fingers. They speak of the days when the Watchers walked among us, the time before forgetting, and the years when the heavens touched the earth. These phrases do not read like myth-making. They read like memory, inherited, fractured, but unmistakably mournful. Even more telling are the anomalies scattered across the earliest cities. Beneath some of the oldest temples in Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu, archaeologists have uncovered architectural layers that predate the earliest dynasties by thousands of years. These structures are perplexing, precisely cut stone blocks that show no signs of primitive tooling, underground chambers with perfect symmetry, and foundations built with techniques that appear far more advanced than the brickwork found above them. Scholars label these anomalies as pre-Sumerian, but the tablets hint that they belonged to the age before the flood, the era the keeper left behind, the era shaped directly by the Anunnaki. One of the most unsettling patterns is that the oldest layers are often the most advanced, while the younger layers appear more crude, inconsistent, or improvised. This is the opposite of what we expect from a developing civilization. Instead of gradual improvement, we see regression. Instead of evolution, we see decline. This strange reversal aligns disturbingly well with the idea that humanity inherited knowledge from a source beyond itself and struggled to maintain it after that source vanished. Just as compelling are the astronomical records. Early Sumerian star charts display a precise understanding of celestial cycles, including precession, a phenomenon not officially discovered until thousands of years later. Certain tablets describe the movements of planets with an accuracy that modern scholars have difficulty explaining. Even more mysterious are references to an additional celestial body, often called the wandering star of the gods, whose orbit does not match any known planet. Whether this was mythic embellishment or an echo of forgotten knowledge remains unknown, but its presence is striking. It is in this context that the role of the keeper becomes clearer. His withdrawal did not simply mark the end of an era, it marked the beginning of a long decline. a fading of knowledge, a fading of memory, and a fading of the connection between humanity and the beings who shaped its earliest destiny. The flood itself served as a kind of boundary marker. Before it, the world was full of wonders. After it, the world became smaller, quieter, and increasingly fragmented. Yet not all fragments were lost. Scattered among the later tablets are hints that the keeper's knowledge survived in coded form. Some scribes reference hidden writings stored in sealed vaults. Others mention tablets that could only be read by initiates. A few describe the language of before, a tongue said to carry power and meaning beyond ordinary speech. These hints suggest that remnants of the old world remained embedded within temples, rituals, and myths, waiting for those capable of understanding them. One particular fragment describes a ritual in which priests sought to bring down the memory of the heavens by chanting syllables that allegedly resonated with the structure of the cosmos. Another describes a set of diagrams used to communicate with the gods, though the diagrams have never been found. A third mentions the metal tablets of Enki, said to contain the secrets of creation itself. These references, though sparse, form a mosaic that points toward a hidden tradition, a lineage of knowledge passed down quietly, away from the eyes of kings and commoners, protected by a small group of initiates who claimed direct descent from the survivors of the flood. But the most important question remains unanswered. Why was this knowledge hidden at all? Why did the world that came after the flood choose to bury, restrict, or fear the truths held by the Keeper and the Anunnaki? In the next block, we will explore the tablets that hint at the answer, the forbidden ones that describe a conflict between gods, a disagreement over humanity's role, and a decision that changed the course of human history forever. As the centuries pass after the Keeper's disappearance, a new pattern begins to emerge in the tablets, one that hints at a deeper, more unsettling truth. The Sumerians increasingly reference tensions among the Anunnaki themselves, suggesting that the withdrawal of the gods was not a peaceful fading, but the result of a profound conflict over humanity's purpose and future. In several early tablets, most damaged, many fragmented, scribes recount a dispute between two factions of the Anunnaki. One group believed humanity was a creation worth guiding, elevating, and empowering. The other saw humans as a mistake, a species that had developed too quickly, with too much curiosity, too much ambition, and too little control. To the latter faction, humans were tools, not heirs, and tools, if they grew unpredictable, became liabilities. One particularly cryptic fragment, often referred to as the division of the Anunnaki, describes a heated celestial council in which Enki, typically associated with wisdom, compassion, and creativity, argued that humanity's potential was not yet realized. He insisted the gifts of knowledge should continue. Opposing him was Enlil, stern, authoritative, and fiercely protective of cosmic order, who warned that humanity's increasing independence threatened the balance of the worlds. The text breaks in the middle of this debate, but the implication is clear. Humanity's rapid advancement was not accidental, nor was it universally approved. This tension becomes even more apparent when we examine the tablets describing the years leading up to the flood. According to the Sumerians, the decision to unleash the deluge was not made by all the gods unanimously. Instead, it was the result of a factional decree, one that Enki actively opposed. Later Sumerian texts portray him as lamenting the decision, going so far as to warn one human, Ziusudra, later known through Akkadian as Atrahasis, and more famously as Noah, in secret. This single rebellious act, passing forbidden knowledge to a human, marks the moment that Enki becomes what later traditions might call the keeper of humanity. It also explains why some tablets refer to him as the one who preserves the seed and the defender of the crafted beings. But the deeper conflict did not end with the flood. Instead, it took a new form, one embedded in the structure of post-flood civilization. The king list states plainly that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, but no nowhere does it say that the same beings returned. In fact, several tablets imply the opposite. The rulers who descend after the flood seem diminished, more abstract, more symbolic. They no longer walk openly among humans. They act through intermediaries, priests, kings, and those entrusted with fragments of ancient knowledge. In other words, the faction that wanted humanity restricted prevailed, and the civilization that rose after the flood was not a continuation of the old world, but a controlled version of it, a reconstruction designed to limit humanity's access to what it once possessed. The most striking evidence of this shift is found in a set of tablets that scholars classify as restricted narratives. These texts describe a series of decrees issued by the gods after the flood. Decrees meant to regulate human behavior, limit human lifespan, and prevent the rediscovery of forbidden knowledge. Among these are references to the reduction of human longevity, once measured in centuries, now constrained to decades. The scattering of humanity into linguistic tribes, fracturing what is described as a unified tongue. The concealment of celestial knowledge, with certain star charts and planetary cycles forbidden from public instruction. The restriction of sacred objects, including the me, the divine building blocks of civilization, which are now guarded and accessible only to elite initiates. These decrees echo eerily across other ancient cultures. The Hebrew Bible speaks of a time when humans lived nearly 1,000 years, then suddenly, inexplicably, much less. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching forbidden arts, only to be punished for giving humanity too much. Greek mythology speaks of the gods diminishing humanity after the Golden Age. Even Hindu scripture describes previous cycles of civilization that ended when humans became too advanced. The Sumerian tablets, however, place these events in explicit historical context. They record them not as myth, but as administrative decisions, rulings handed down by cosmic authorities. And woven throughout these texts is an unspoken implication. Humanity was never meant to remember the old world. The flood was not merely a natural disaster or symbolic cleansing. It was a reset, a deliberate erasure. But traces of the old knowledge survived, not in the hands of kings or priests, but within the remnants left behind by the keeper. These remnants appear in the form of anomalous artifacts, perfectly carved stones, impossible astronomical alignments, stories of beings who shone like fire, and underground chambers whose purpose remains unknown. They appear in languages that emerge fully developed with no ancestor tongues. They appear in star maps that match the sky of a world long before recorded history. And most importantly, they appear in the oral traditions passed down through generations. Stories of beings who fell from the sky, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and then vanished, leaving behind only fragments of their legacy. As the conflict between the factions of the Anunnaki fades into myth, a new question arises, one the tablets hint at but never fully answer. Did all of the old teachers leave, or did some remain, silent, hidden, guiding humanity indirectly, waiting for the right moment to resurface? In the next block, we will explore the archaeological evidence that suggests the survivors of the old world, both human and possibly non-human, left behind markers meant to be rediscovered only when humanity was ready. As the centuries pass beyond the flood era resets, another pattern begins to emerge, one that is not written in clay but carved into stone, aligned with stars, and buried in the foundations of the world's oldest cities. It is a pattern that suggests the survivors of the old age, whether human, divine, or something in between, left behind clues, not stories, not myths, instructions. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and even the Americas, archaeologists have uncovered structures that defy the expected capabilities of early civilizations. These sites share architectural similarities, astronomical alignments, and construction methods that appear strangely unified, as if they came from a single teaching tradition preserved across continents. The Sumerians themselves claimed that such knowledge was not invented, but inherited. And when we examine their physical world, not just their tablets, the evidence for inheritance only grows stronger. Let's begin with something the Sumerians never explicitly wrote down, but demonstrated with absolute precision. Their cities were aligned to the heavens. Eridu, regarded in their texts as the first city where kingship descended, is built along a perfect north-south axis. Uruk aligns its great temples with the heliacal rising of Venus, the planet associated with Inanna. Nippur, the spiritual center of Sumer, is mathematically placed according to celestial precincts described in their cosmology, a point where heaven and earth meet. This level of astronomical engineering appears instantly in the archaeological record, fully formed. There is no early clumsy phase, no trial and error. The earliest layers already contain precise alignments requiring centuries of observation, unless, of course, the observation had already been done by someone else. This same pattern repeats worldwide. The pyramids of Giza align with Orion's belt. Teotihuacan mirrors that same constellation across an entire city. Göbekli Tepe, predating Sumer by millennia, contains enclosures aligned to celestial events and engraved with star maps only now being deciphered. The conventional explanation is cultural coincidence. But coincidences do not create identical engineering principles, identical alignments, identical sacred geometries spread among civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other, which leads to a question almost too big for mainstream archaeology to approach. Who taught the first teachers? A set of inscriptions from the early dynastic period provides a cryptic answer. These texts describe a group known as the Abgal, Akkadian, Apkallu, 7 sages sent by the gods before the flood to establish the foundations of civilization. They are credited with designing the earliest cities, establishing laws, teaching writing, calculating the movements of the stars, building the first temples, and ordering the world according to the patterns of heaven. After the flood, a new set of sages emerged, half divine, half human, who continued this work. Each sage is associated with a specific city, each one linked to a specific domain of knowledge. But the earlier pre-flood sages are described very differently. They are not depicted as kings or priests. Instead, they appear in cylinder seals as towering figures, scaled beings, or shining entities holding strange objects, including the infamous handbag motif, found not just in Sumer but in Mesoamerica, in ancient Turkey, and even carved in stone at Göbekli Tepe. This motif transcends time and geography. One explanation is pure coincidence. Another is diffusion from an unknown prehistoric culture. And the third, whispered by the tablets but avoided by scholars, is that these beings were not human. But the archaeological evidence complicates things further. In the deepest strata of ancient Mesopotamian sites, beneath the Sumerian layers, beneath the flood deposits, archaeologists have found artifacts that should not exist. Tools made with techniques unknown to early humans, fragments of metals that required heat far beyond Bronze Age furnaces, and vitrified surfaces that appear melted by extreme temperatures. Even more disturbing are the biological anomalies: elongated skulls, skeletons with unusual cranial sutures, individuals with bone density and height far exceeding typical human variation. These remains are rarely discussed in academic circles, not because they are insignificant, but because they disrupt the standard evolutionary timeline. When viewed through the lens of Sumerian cosmology, however, they become part of a larger, coherent picture, a picture of a world inhabited by multiple intelligent beings, some human, some not, before a catastrophic event reshaped the earth and reset civilization. But perhaps the most significant evidence of all comes from the structures themselves. For example, in Eridu, beneath layer after layer of temples, archaeologists discovered another foundation, a structure built with techniques far older and far more sophisticated than the layers above. This deep foundation contains architectural elements that do not match any known cultural style in Mesopotamia. It exists as if it belonged to a different era entirely, one erased from the historical timeline. The same pattern is found at other sites, foundations older than the civilizations built on top of them, architectural ghosts from cultures we cannot identify, stonework carved with precision machines we cannot replicate using Bronze Age tools. Again and again, the earth reveals that ancient civilizations did not begin from nothing. They began atop the ruins of something older. This reality echoes the Sumerian claim that their knowledge was inherited, not invented, and it raises a question that will guide our next deep investigation. What exactly was erased during the flood, and what fragments have survived despite every attempt, natural or otherwise, to bury them? In the next block, we'll explore the forbidden astronomical knowledge found in the oldest Sumerian tablets, knowledge so advanced that some scholars privately admit it should not exist at that point in history. When we turn from the ruins to the tablets themselves, the story becomes even stranger. If the physical world hints that knowledge survived a catastrophic reset, the earliest Sumerian writings say it openly, and with a level of astronomical sophistication that should have been impossible for a Bronze Age people. Among the most troubling discoveries in Assyriology is a set of texts known as the Mul-Apian tablets. These tablets contain star catalogs, planetary cycles, eclipse predictions, and detailed celestial calculations. They do not read like early observations, nor like mythology. They read like the work of trained astronomers using inherited data. What makes the Mul-Apian so extraordinary is not just its content, but its accuracy. It records the synodic period of Venus, the orbital cycles of Jupiter and Saturn, the heliacal rising patterns of constellations, and the correct length of the solar year within a fraction of a second. Modern astronomers confirm these values with precision instruments. Yet the Sumerians recorded them thousands of years earlier, long before lenses, clocks, or advanced mathematical tools. This begs a question. How did the first civilization on Earth begin with knowledge it should not have possessed? Sumerian cosmology provides a cryptic but consistent answer. The knowledge was given, not developed. In their own words, the stars were not discovered, they were remembered. One particular line repeated in multiple astronomical texts haunts researchers, as in the old writings, observed before the flood. This implies that the Sumerians believed or knew that their celestial knowledge predated their own civilization. Some modern scholars reinterpret this phrase metaphorically. Others admit privately that they cannot explain it. But the problem goes deeper. The precision of Sumerian astronomical tables requires continuous observation for many centuries. Venus's full cycle, for example, takes more than 1,000 years to track accurately. Jupiter's cycle requires knowledge spanning generations. Yet the first cities of Sumer appear suddenly, without any long prehistory of gradual scientific development, unless the observations had already been made before the cities rose. The Sumerian texts repeatedly attribute this knowledge to the Abgal, Apkallu, sages, the Anuna, Anunnaki beings, and to those who descended from the sky before the flood in the Mul-Apian. The star list itself is introduced with the statement, "This is the knowledge of the ancient ones." Another set of tablets, known as the Enuma Anu Enlil, includes eclipse predictions with mathematical constants that scholars once assumed were the result of long-term Babylonian calculations. But the tablets themselves state that the data were copied from earlier sources older than the flood. This creates a timeline problem that mainstream archaeology cannot reconcile. 1. Astronomical data requiring centuries of observation appear instantly with Sumer. 2. The tablets claim they were copied from pre-flood records. 3. Physical evidence shows a real catastrophic flood layer beneath early cities. 4. Therefore, the knowledge must have survived from an older civilization. Of course, this is impossible if history unfolded in a linear, human-only progression, which is why, for over a century, scholars have treated the astronomical tablets with cautious language, symbolic, ritualistic, approximate, or coincidental. But modern analysis has shown these excuses to be incorrect. The data are too consistent, the mathematics too advanced, the observations too precise. Something else is at play. Even more disturbing are the celestial maps inscribed on some tablets. They contain constellations visible only in the southern hemisphere, star formations that were not visible over Mesopotamia for thousands of years, diagrams that some researchers believe represent precessional movements. One tablet, known as the K8538, shows a star cluster that aligns with the sky as it appeared around 10,500 BC, long before the rise of any known civilization. This date appears again and again across ancient cultures. The orientation of the Giza pyramids, astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe, the beginning of the Sumerian antediluvian kings, the Younger Dryas extinction events. Either ancient peoples independently reference the same period, or they shared a common historical memory. The Sumerians insist this memory came from the time before the waters, when the sages walked with kings. The implications are extraordinary. A forgotten civilization may have existed long before Sumer. Its knowledge may have been preserved through a select group of survivors. The Sumerians may not have been the first civilization, only the first after the reset. And the descent from heaven may describe the return of those survivors, or something else entirely. Sumerian scribes were not vague about this. They wrote, "We did not measure the heavens first. We were taught the measures." In the next block, we will confront the tablets that describe these teachers directly, inscriptions that scholars rarely discuss and in some cases intentionally avoid. The deeper we go into Sumerian writings, the more a single theme emerges. The first kings, the first astronomers, the first builders, and the first priests did not invent civilization. They inherited it, and the tablets describe their teachers with unsettling clarity. Among the most enigmatic of these teachers are the Abgal, known later as the Apkallu. These beings appear across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts as the sages who existed before the flood. They are described not as spirits, nor as symbolic archetypes, but as physical entities who walked among early humans and instructed them directly. The earliest tablets make a critical distinction between two types of beings: the Anuna, or Anunnaki, described as powerful, sky-associated figures, often ruling or judging; the Abgal, Apkallu, the intermediaries, the ones who delivered knowledge and shaped early society. In the most ancient layers of Sumerian literature, the Abgal are listed by name. 7 sages before the flood, each linked to a specific city, each credited with establishing a foundational element of civilization. The list appears with no mythic phrasing, no allegory, but as a simple administrative record. One sage built the first temples, another established the measurement systems, another organized irrigation and agriculture, another taught the arts of writing and accounting, another introduced laws and social structures. Modern scholars often treat these as mythological titles, yet the texts describe them in the same format that later tablets use for historical kings and officials. The line between myth and record is erased. Sumerian priests recited hymns in which the sages rose from the water and walked among the black-headed people. The term water has led many to assume the creatures were symbolic fishmen, but in Akkadian translations, Apsu, the word for water, is also used to describe a hidden realm, a deep enclosure, or a sealed domain beneath or beyond ordinary experience. It can refer to the cosmic deep as easily as the literal ocean. The sages are not described as aquatic. They are described as emerging from a realm inaccessible to ordinary humans, bringing with them plans, knowledge, and tools that would serve as the backbone of civilization. One line states, "They came forth fully knowing what had been lost. Lost from where? Lost from whom? The most detailed description comes from a tablet catalogued as W23007. Its translation has rarely been published in popular texts. It describes the first Abgal, Ana, as one who completed the plans of heaven and earth, a phrase used elsewhere only to describe divine architects. He is credited with establishing Eridu as the center of civilization, not building it, but re-establishing what was before. This suggests the city was not new, it was a reconstruction. Another sage, Enmeduga, is said to have restored the forgotten arts. A third, Enmegalama, set in order what the flood had confused. These are not mythical descriptions of creation. They are descriptions of rebuilding after catastrophe, guided by beings who retained knowledge from an earlier age. Perhaps the most unsettling detail is found in a tablet describing the seventh sage, Utuabzu. It says he ascended to heaven after completing his work. The phrase is identical to the one used to describe later kings who were deified after death. Yet here it appears in the earliest stratum of Sumerian writing, applied to a being explicitly labeled before the flood. What kind of entity ascends after finishing its task? A teacher returning home? If the Abgal were simply mythological, their influence should fade as Sumerian culture evolves. But instead, the opposite happens. Later kings claim lineage from the sages. Priests invoke their names in rituals to access the knowledge of the time before. Even in the Neo-Babylonian period, thousands of years later, scribes still reference the Abgal as historical. But the clearest evidence lies not in what the tablets say, but in what they assume. The Sumerians believed that the knowledge given by the sages was incomplete, fragments of a greater system that humans were incapable of fully comprehending. One tablet laments, "We know the measures, but not their root." Another, "The plans are ours, but the purpose is lost." This is the voice of a culture holding tools it does not fully understand, repeating inherited systems without remembering their original functions. In temple inscriptions, early rulers often declare that the gods showed them the foundation plans. But these plans are described as physical blueprints, carried or bestowed by the sages, often contained in sealed chests or tablets of stone. This echoes the tradition of the me, the divine objects of civilization. The me were not abstract laws. They were portable, transferable, storable. Multiple myths describe them being loaded onto boats, taken from cities, recovered, or lost. The implication is unavoidable. The Sumerians believed that civilization was not an invention, but a technology. And if the Abgal were the ones who delivered this technology, then the earliest stories of humanity are not tales of creation, they are tales of restoration. In the next block, we will confront the one question that emerges from these accounts. If the sages rebuilt civilization after the flood, what exactly was destroyed before it? What the sages rebuilt is hinted at everywhere, yet described nowhere in full. The Sumerians speak of what came before, of the kingdoms before the waters, of ages when the great ones ruled, but they never provide a complete account of the world that existed prior to the cataclysm. Instead, they leave fragments, scattered phrases, broken myths, cryptic symbols, like pieces of a shattered mosaic whose full image has been deliberately obscured. To understand what was destroyed, we must examine these fragments with the same attention the ancients gave to their star charts. The first clue lies in the Sumerian king list, the most controversial historical document of early Mesopotamia. It begins with a chilling statement. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists rulers whose reigns stretched not decades, but thousands of years. 8 antediluvian kings rule for a combined total of 241,200 years before the flood sweeps them away. Mainstream scholars dismiss these numbers as symbolic exaggerations, but similar lifespans appear in the Hebrew Bible, Iranian mythology, Indian texts, and even early Chinese records. Civilizations separated by geography and time all speak of a pre-flood age in which humans, or beings among humans, lived far longer, ruled far longer, and possessed knowledge that vanished after a great catastrophe. If we take the king list at face value, the pre-flood world was governed by long-lived rulers who were far more than mortal kings. The tablets use terms like shepherds of the people, those who knew the plans, and those who spoke with the sky beings. These descriptors imply the antediluvian kings were intermediaries between humanity and the Anunnaki, figures bridging the worlds of divine and human, trained in knowledge no longer accessible after the reset. The second clue appears in the Eridu Genesis tablets, which describe the world before the flood as orderly, prosperous, and guided directly by the gods. Cities were not built from scratch. They were assigned by the gods to specific rulers. Agriculture, metallurgy, mathematics, and governance are all described as already functioning systems. There is no narrative of discovery or invention. Instead, the text implies humanity entered a world already structured, waiting to be inhabited and managed, not created from nothing. This portrayal is echoed in global traditions. In Mesoamerican myths, the gods construct multiple worlds, each destroyed and rebuilt. In Hindu texts, Vishnu's avatars appear at the end of each age to restore cosmic order. In Plato's dialogue, Critias, the tale of Atlantis describes a technologically advanced civilization that fell due to internal conflict and divine judgment. These parallels do not prove a shared historical event, but they suggest a shared memory, a cultural echo of an ancient world brought down by forces beyond its control. Another clue is found in the ruins themselves. Beneath early Sumerian settlements, archaeologists have uncovered structures built with techniques that seem incompatible with the later culture. These older layers show evidence of advanced drainage systems, precise stonework, and foundations that remain stable thousands of years later. The architectural skill appears suddenly and then diminishes. Rather than a trajectory of progress, the archaeological record suggests a decline from an earlier sophistication. Geological evidence adds yet another layer to this puzzle. Multiple sediment cores across Mesopotamia show a massive flood layer dating to around 2900-3000 BCE. But beneath that layer, there is evidence of a long, stable period in which advanced irrigation systems supported large populations. This stable era aligns eerily well with the reigns of the antediluvian kings described in the Sumerian king list. The Sumerians also hint at something else, something even more difficult to reconcile with the conventional timeline. Some tablets describe the shining cities, the temples that hummed, and the towers that touched the vault of heaven. These may be poetic descriptions, but when similar phrases appear in texts from Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica, the possibility emerges that they refer to real structures, monuments of an earlier civilization whose ruins now lie buried, dismantled, or eroded beyond recognition. The pre-flood world, then, begins to look like this: a vast, organized, technologically sophisticated civilization, guided by beings whose knowledge surpassed that of humans, governed through long-lived rulers trained by the gods, and maintained by systems inherited from an even earlier age. This world flourished for millennia until a profound conflict between the gods themselves culminated in the decision to remove humanity's access to advanced knowledge. Some scholars interpret the flood as a natural catastrophe magnified by myth, but the Sumerians insist it was intentional. Their texts emphasize that the gods met in council, deliberated, and chose destruction as a corrective act. This raises a troubling possibility. The pre-flood civilization may have reached a threshold considered dangerous, either for humanity itself or for the cosmic order the gods sought to maintain. If the flood was a reset, the sages' mission after it becomes clear. They were not creating civilization, but reconstructing a safer, limited version of what came before. But the question remains, why did the gods believe the old world had to be erased? In the next block, we'll examine the Sumerian accounts of the growing tensions that led to the flood, a story of rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and divine conflict that reveals the true reason the ancient world was destroyed. The world that existed before the flood did not collapse overnight. According to the Sumerian tablets, its downfall was the result of escalating tensions between humans and the gods, between factions of the Anunnaki themselves, and ultimately between competing visions for the future of Earth. This conflict, described in fragments across multiple texts, is the hidden engine behind the Great Cataclysm. To understand why the flood was unleashed, we must reconstruct the chain of events that shattered the old world. The earliest sign of trouble appears in the Atrahasis epic, which describes humanity in its earliest form as obedient, limited, and closely supervised. The Anunnaki used humans as laborers for irrigation systems, mining operations, and agricultural expansion. But as generations passed, humanity multiplied and began to change. The tablets speak of human noise, a poetic term that scholars interpret as population growth. But alternative researchers argue it refers to something deeper: independence, organization, perhaps even resistance. Enlil, the chief of the council and overseer of Earth, grows increasingly frustrated. He complains that humans are becoming restless, unruly, and aware of things forbidden. This phrase, things forbidden, appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature and always points to knowledge the gods did not intend humans to possess. What were these forbidden things? The tablets provide hints: skills of observation of the heavens, secrets of longevity, construction techniques that bridged earth and sky, weapons or tools not meant for mortal hands, rituals that allowed humans to access divine realms. The Sumerian scribes never explain these secrets outright. They describe them only in metaphors: shining stones, humming tablets, divine measures, celestial paths. But the consistency suggests humans were rapidly advancing, acquiring knowledge that once belonged exclusively to the Anunnaki. This progress was not accidental. Another group of gods, led by Enki, actively supported humanity's development. Enki is portrayed as the patron of knowledge, science, and human potential. Where Enlil favors control and hierarchy, Enki favors empowerment and autonomy. These opposing philosophies became the central fault line in the divine conflict. Enki teaches humans agriculture, medicine, engineering, and writing. He shows them how to build cities and canals, how to measure time, and how to understand the stars. The tablets describe him lifting the veil and loosening the tongue, metaphors for unlocking intellectual capacity. Under Enki's influence, humans begin to resemble the gods more closely in intellect, if not in longevity. This alarms Enlil. In the Atrahasis text, he responds not with education, but with suppression. He enacts a series of punitive measures to reduce the human population. First comes plague, targeted and devastating. When Enki secretly helps humans survive by teaching them medicine, Enlil unleashes drought, then famine. Each time, Enki undermines the plan, giving humanity just enough knowledge to endure. The conflict escalates until the divine council reaches a critical decision. Humanity must be reset. The gods, according to the tablets, believe the experiment has spiraled out of control. Humans have acquired too much, too quickly. They have become like the gods in thought, a phrase that echoes the warnings of other ancient traditions. The council decrees the flood. Enki opposes the decision but is bound by the council's secrecy oath. Unable to defy it directly, he speaks through symbols, dreams, and riddles. He warns Atrahasis, later known as Utnapishtim, to build a vessel, an ark, not out of rebellion, but to preserve a remnant of humanity. This act of compassion pits Enki against the council and places him at the center of the pre-flood resistance. The Eridu Genesis tablets reveal that the flood itself was not a simple storm. It was a cosmic event, a coordinated release of forces that involved the heavens, the atmosphere, and the earth itself. The tablets describe the star of terror rising in the sky, winds that never ceased, waters from the deep erupting, a darkness that covered the land like a shroud, sounds like the shaking of the firmament. These descriptions may be poetic, or they may record an event involving astronomical disturbance, tectonic upheaval, or both. Some researchers see hints of a cometary impact, others of a sudden polar shift, and still others of an engineered destruction performed with technology that ancient people could only describe in mythic language. When the flood ends, the world is unrecognizable. Cities are destroyed. Records are lost. The long-lived rulers are gone. Humanity is reduced to scattered survivors, and the Anunnaki themselves are divided, some mourning, some furious, some silent. In the aftermath, Enlil's perspective changes. Seeing the devastation, he expresses regret. But the decision stands. Humanity will be allowed to rebuild, but under strict limitations. Lifespans are drastically shortened. The direct presence of the gods is withdrawn. Knowledge, once freely shared, becomes compartmentalized and controlled. The age of open contact is over. This is the world the sages inherited, a traumatized planet, stripped of its old power, forced into a new order designed to prevent humanity from rising too high again. But the tablets hint at something else, something even more mysterious. What happened to the Anunnaki after the flood? Did they stay? Did they leave? Did they split into factions? Did some remain in hidden places? The next block explores the enigmatic disappearance of the gods and the lingering traces they left behind across the ancient world. When the waters receded and the survivors emerged into a world reshaped by devastation, the Anunnaki faced a choice that would determine the course of human history. The tablets do not describe a triumphant return of the gods, nor do they present a unified response. Instead, they preserve a haunting pattern: division, silence, retreat, and a gradual disappearance that left ancient civilizations grasping for explanations. To understand what happened to the Anunnaki after the flood, we must follow the fragments they left scattered across myth, ritual, and early kingship traditions. The first layer of this mystery appears in the Sumerian king list, which notes that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again, but with a critical difference. The rulers who follow are no longer beings of impossible longevity. Their reigns shrink from thousands of years to centuries, then to mere decades. The change is abrupt and clearly intentional. It suggests that the gods who once directly governed the world either withdrew from leadership or delegated authority to humans. This is the first clue that the Anunnaki were stepping back from their earlier role. The tablets describe a post-flood council where the gods divide territories, appoint new overseers, and establish boundaries between themselves and humanity. Some remain involved in earthly affairs, Inanna among them, while others fade into distant realms. Enlil, once the dominant force, appears increasingly remote. Enki retreats to the deep, continuing to guide humanity through dreams, symbols, and occasional interventions. Other deities vanish almost entirely from the record, remembered only through obscure hymns and ritual names. Why did they withdraw? The texts offer several possibilities. One explanation lies in the trauma of the flood itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the gods trembling, crying out, and fleeing to the highest heaven as the waters rose. Even divine beings, in the Sumerian worldview, could feel fear. The destruction unleashed may have fractured the council and driven some away from Earth entirely. Another explanation involves the burden of the new human condition. After the flood, humans were redesigned, shorter-lived, more numerous, more independent. The gods recognized that direct rule would no longer be feasible. Instead, they shaped a model in which humans governed themselves, guided not by presence, but by memory. This shift from oversight to distance marks a turning point in the relationship between the two species. Yet the most provocative explanation lies hidden in the tablet's references to the holy ones who departed and the watchers who returned to the sky. These cryptic lines appear in several later Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Scholars often dismiss them as poetic flourishes, but when read in context, they hint at a genuine departure, an exodus of divine beings from Earth. Other ancient cultures echo this pattern. Egyptian records speak of the Neteru ruling in the beginning before retreating to the sky. The Maya describe gods who walked among men before returning to the heavens. In early Vedic literature, the Devas withdraw after catastrophic conflict. These parallels suggest a shared cultural memory of beings who once lived on Earth and then vanished. But departure does not mean absence. The tablets emphasize that although the gods withdrew physically, they continued to influence the world through intermediaries and chosen cities. Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk remain sacred centers where the presence of the divine is felt even in silence. Temples are described as docking places, gates, and platforms for descent, terms that hint at functions now lost to time. In this post-flood era, humanity becomes responsible for maintaining order through ritual. Priests perform ceremonies as in days of old, attempting to mimic forgotten practices. Kings claim divine mandate, presenting themselves as representatives of gods who no longer walk among men. But the tablets make clear that these rituals are shadows, not the real interactions that existed before the cataclysm. This shift created a profound psychological effect. Humans remembered the age when the Anunnaki were present, but they lived in a time when their presence felt distant. The gap between memory and reality became fertile ground for myths, reinterpretations, and competing narratives. It is in this vacuum that the role of the semi-divine kings emerges. The early post-flood kings are described as part human, part divine. These rulers serve as the bridge between the world that was and the world that came after. Their reigns mark the transitional era when humanity still felt the direct influence of the gods, but was beginning to chart its own path. Over generations, the divine bloodlines diluted, and the kings became fully human, but their titles, rituals, and responsibilities preserved echoes of their celestial predecessors. The disappearance of the Anunnaki also gave rise to secret traditions, orders of scribes, priests, and watchers tasked with preserving forbidden knowledge. The tablets refer to keepers of the hidden wisdom, individuals entrusted with fragments of pre-flood technology, astronomy, and cosmology. These guardians became the custodians of a memory too dangerous to lose, yet too potent to reveal completely. As centuries passed, the gods' withdrawal grew more complete. Their names persisted, their temples endured, and their stories were retold, but their physical presence faded. Humans increasingly relied on symbols, omens, and interpretations, rather than direct encounters. By the time of the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, the Anunnaki had become mythic figures rather than active participants. Yet the question lingers: did they truly leave, or did they retreat to hidden realms, mountain sanctuaries, underground halls, or celestial domains, watching silently as humanity rebuilt itself? The next block follows this question into the deeper shadows, exploring the hidden traces of the Anunnaki, those that survived in rituals, myths, architecture, and the whispered traditions of later ages. The disappearance of the Anunnaki did not erase their influence. Instead, it transformed it. In the centuries following their withdrawal, civilizations across Mesopotamia developed new religious, political, and scientific systems that carried unmistakable echoes of an older world, an age when humans lived under the direct oversight of beings whose power shaped the fabric of reality. The question that emerges from this period is not simply where the Anunnaki went, but what traces they deliberately left behind and who was entrusted to carry their legacy forward. To answer this, we must follow the threads that run through ritual architecture, sacred knowledge, and the mysterious orders that emerged as custodians of forbidden truths. The first clue appears in the temples themselves. Structures like the Eanna, Ekur, and Eabzu were more than religious monuments. Their foundations contain architectural anomalies uncharacteristic of early human construction, perfect alignments with celestial bodies, mathematically precise measurements, and layered designs that seem to encode cosmological knowledge. The ziggurats, in particular, mimic stepped platforms described as mountain houses, a name that suggests they were built as terrestrial replicas of celestial or otherworldly places. These temples functioned as memory anchors, preserving in stone the cosmic order once maintained by the gods. But architecture is only the beginning. The rituals performed within these structures reveal a second layer of continuity. Priests followed elaborate sequences of chants, offerings, and symbolic gestures believed to restore the bonds between earth and the heavens. These rituals, though clearly conducted by humans, often reference older ceremonies said to have been performed in the presence of the Shining Ones. Even after the gods' disappearance, the rituals continued, perhaps out of devotion, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because those who performed them believed the Anunnaki might one day return. The tablets also mention a group known as the Apkallu, semi-divine beings who survived the flood and served as intermediaries between gods and humans. Traditionally depicted as sages or advisors, the Apkallu possess features that blend human and otherworldly traits. Their role in post-flood society was to transmit fragments of pre-cataclysmic knowledge, agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, law, to the early kings. These beings are portrayed not as mythic abstractions, but as real individuals whose teachings shaped the earliest civilizations. Scholars have long debated their identity. Were they literal survivors of the Old Age, or were they symbolic representations of knowledge preserved through oral tradition? Whatever the case, their presence in the texts suggests that the Anunnaki did not vanish without leaving behind appointed successors. Another mysterious tradition is the Tablet of Destinies, a powerful artifact said to contain cosmic laws governing fate, kingship, and the movements of the stars. Possession of this tablet is a recurring theme in Mesopotamian mythology, often associated with authority over both gods and humans. Its appearance in various myths indicates that even after the gods' retreat, certain families, temples, or secret orders claimed access to esoteric knowledge believed to originate from the Anunnaki themselves. The tablet may represent a symbolic codex of astronomical cycles or an actual artifact lost to time. Either way, it stands as a symbol of the power structures left behind by the departing gods. As the centuries passed, the Anunnaki became increasingly remote, yet their memory refused to fade. In dreams, visions, and divination rituals, priests claim to receive messages from them. Some texts describe voices from the deep and lights in the sky, associated with divine activity long after the gods' physical disappearance. These accounts blur the line between myth and observation. Were they psychological echoes of a vanished age, or remnants of continued but limited contact with beings who now resided elsewhere? Even more intriguing are the scattered references to forbidden knowledge, secrets of heaven and earth that only certain scribes were permitted to access. Some tablets speak of hidden chambers beneath temples where ancient inscriptions were stored, sealed away to prevent misuse. Others describe teachings too dangerous to record in writing, passed orally from priest to priest. This suggests the existence of closed lineages dedicated to preserving the Anunnaki's legacy. These lineages may have formed the basis of later mystery schools and esoteric traditions found across the Near East. Outside Mesopotamia, parallels emerge. Egyptian temple inscriptions speak of the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings said to have ruled before the first human pharaohs. In the Indus Valley, Vedic traditions describe sages who carried cosmic knowledge from earlier ages. Even in Anatolia and the Caucasus, myths speak of beings who withdrew to remote mountains after teaching early humans. These global echoes hint at a shared cultural memory, a coordinated retreat of entities who once guided humanity across different regions. Further evidence of the Anunnaki's lingering influence appears in the sudden rise of scientific systems across early civilizations. Astronomy, mathematics, and law all emerge fully formed, with sophistication that suggests inheritance rather than invention. The sexagesimal system, the division of time into precise units, and the mapping of celestial cycles all appear abruptly in Sumer. If humans develop these systems independently, the speed of advancement is extraordinary. If the Anunnaki gifted or inspired them, the pattern becomes easier to explain. By the first millennium BCE, however, the Anunnaki had largely transformed into symbolic figures, archetypes representing cosmic forces rather than literal beings. Yet the deepest traditions continued to hint at their historical presence. The idea of divine kingship, the structure of temple rituals, the organization of early law codes, and the preservation of hidden knowledge all point back to a period when the gods were real, tangible, and intimately involved in the affairs of Earth. The next block takes us deeper into this post-flood world, following the lineages and legends that claimed direct descent from the Anunnaki. Who inherited their knowledge? Who guarded their secrets? And what traces of their presence can still be found in the hidden corridors of ancient history? The lineages said to descend from the Anunnaki form one of the most elusive threads in ancient history. These families, priesthoods, and royal houses appear across early civilizations with sudden authority, advanced knowledge, or mysterious origins that set them apart from ordinary people. Their stories, scattered across tablets, inscriptions, and oral traditions, suggest that the withdrawal of the Anunnaki did not mark a clean severing from humanity. Instead, it set the stage for a hidden custodial era, a time when selected individuals carried the remnants of the gods' teachings while the rest of the world moved through cycles of rise and collapse. Understanding these lineages brings us closer to the forbidden truths hinted at in the oldest Sumerian tablets. The Sumerian king list is the first and most provocative piece of evidence. Before the flood, it describes kings ruling for impossibly long spans, thousands of years per ruler. Mainstream scholars interpret these numbers as symbolic, but the pattern is too consistent to ignore. The list then divides sharply at the flood. Post-Diluvian kings exhibit dramatically shorter lifespans, yet their genealogies often trace directly back to figures associated with the gods. This transition suggests that ancient scribes preserved a memory of two kinds of beings, those who reigned before the cataclysm with extended longevity, and those who inherited their authority afterward. Whether these pre-flood rulers were literal Anunnaki, hybrid beings, or members of an earlier civilization, the implication is the same. Early kingship was not simply political, but cosmological. In Mesopotamia, priestly orders played an equally critical role in preserving divine knowledge. Temples such as those in Eridu, Nippur, and Ur acted as hubs where esoteric teachings were guarded. High priests were not merely ritual specialists, they were astronomers, mathematicians, linguists, and archivists. Some texts describe them as initiates of the deep, a phrase that hints at access to knowledge far older than the civilizations they served. Their role extended beyond religion. They advised kings, interpreted celestial signs, and maintained traditions said to originate from the age when gods walked among humans. If the Anunnaki entrusted anyone with their legacy, it was these priestly elites. A particularly enigmatic group is the brotherhood associated with Enki. Their writings emphasize secrecy, coded language, and the preservation of the hidden instructions. Unlike the followers of Enlil, who believed in rigid authority and cosmic order, Enki's lineages focused on adaptability, knowledge, and protection of humanity. Some researchers believe these traditions later evolved into mystery schools across the ancient world. Their teachings appear in texts about the Abzu, described not only as a subterranean realm of water, but also as a metaphorical reservoir of knowledge preserved from an earlier age. If any group maintained a direct link to pre-flood wisdom, it was likely those aligned with Enki's tradition. Beyond the temple walls, the idea of divine lineage shaped early royal houses. Kings across Mesopotamia claimed descent from gods not merely to legitimize their rule, but to assert continuity with a lost order. The earliest rulers of Kish, Uruk, and Akkad described themselves as shepherds appointed by the heavens, echoing the belief that leadership was once a divine assignment rather than a human achievement. This belief persisted through later cultures. Egyptian pharaohs described themselves as sons of Ra. Hittite kings traced ancestry to storm gods. Early Indian dynasties claimed descent from celestial beings. These patterns suggest that civilization after the flood maintained a collective memory of rulers whose authority derived from contact with beings who came from the sky. Yet lineages fade. As centuries passed, the explicit references to the Anunnaki softened. Their direct names were replaced by generalized titles: gods, kings, sages, but clues remained. Certain families held unusual privileges across generations, controlling knowledge, land, or technology unavailable to others. Some maintained symbols resembling pre-flood iconography: wings, stars, pine cones, and rods. These motifs appear not only in Mesopotamia but across distant cultures, raising questions about a shared origin. Did these families carry remnants of lost knowledge across continents? Or did they inherit myths that shaped their identity long after the original events were forgotten? The tablets also mention the Mi, powerful decrees representing the building blocks of civilization. These were said to be distributed by the gods to the rulers of the early cities. Scholars interpret the Mi as cultural artifacts, laws, arts, crafts, but the texts describe them as physical objects, stored, transferred, and occasionally stolen. Their association with divine authority and technological advancement suggests that they may represent something more concrete, perhaps tools or devices from the Anunnaki themselves. If so, the lineages entrusted with the Mi would have become stewards of knowledge far beyond their contemporaries. Another clue lies in stories of watchers, beings said to observe and record human development after the gods withdrew. These watchers appear in later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, often reimagined as angels or guardians, but their earliest forms in Mesopotamian texts describe them as beings stationed at boundaries: mountains, rivers, celestial gates. Their role was not to intervene, but to monitor, suggesting that the Anunnaki may have maintained distant oversight even after leaving the human realm. Whether literal or symbolic, the idea of watchers reinforces the concept of an ongoing relationship between humanity and its early guides. Archaeology offers subtle hints as well. Across ancient sites, researchers find abrupt shifts in craftsmanship, unexplained advances in metallurgy, and artifacts whose origins seem older than the layers in which they were found. These anomalies could represent remnants of pre-flood knowledge preserved by lineages who survived the cataclysm. If the Anunnaki passed down tools, instructions, or devices, their traces may lie buried within these enigmatic objects. As we approach the final block, the question becomes inescapable. If knowledge was preserved, lineages were established, and rituals maintained, then what exactly did the Anunnaki intend? Was humanity meant to rise, fall, and rise again? Were the gods preparing their creation for independence or for a future return? The deepest answers lie in the closing reflections, where myth, memory, and the long arc of human destiny converge. The story of the Anunnaki, scattered across clay tablets and buried beneath millennia of dust, ultimately leads not to a conclusion, but to a threshold, a place where myth, history, and human intuition meet. As we arrive at the final chapter of this narrative, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. The past described by the Sumerians was never meant to be a closed book. It was a fragment, a surviving piece of a much older tapestry woven across cycles of rise, collapse, preservation, and rebirth. What makes the Anunnaki mystery so compelling is not the certainty of their existence, but the persistence of their memory. Something happened in humanity's earliest dawn, something powerful enough to echo through language, architecture, religion, and cosmology long after the beings at its center vanished from the world. The clay tablets do not simply recount myths. They preserve a worldview in which human civilization did not begin alone. They speak of beings who shaped cities, taught sciences, and governed with authority derived from cosmic law. They describe a world in which humanity was guided, corrected, elevated, and at times constrained. This world feels far removed from our own, yet its influence is everywhere, in our calendars, our measurements, our legal systems, and the very structure of our stories. Even as scholars categorize these texts as mythology, the precision of their descriptions, the consistency across cultures, and the sophistication of their cosmology suggest that the earliest humans remembered more than we assume. What remains most intriguing is the Anunnaki's departure. It was not a disappearance into oblivion, but a transition, an orchestrated withdrawal that left behind lineages, institutions, and encoded knowledge capable of guiding humanity long after direct contact ceased. Whether they ascended to the heavens, relocated to distant realms, or retreated into dimensions beyond ordinary perception, their exit marked the beginning of human autonomy. But autonomy did not mean severance. The rituals, symbols, and celestial maps they left behind acted as markers, invitations for future generations to rediscover truths that had been concealed for their protection. Across civilizations, echoes of this withdrawal appear. Gods who promise to return, teachers who vanish into the mountains, knowledge that emerges in cycles rather than through linear progress. These motifs suggest a universal archetype, a memory of guidance followed by abandonment, of connection followed by longing. Humanity, awakened too quickly by contact with beings beyond its comprehension, was left to navigate the consequences of that awakening. The search for the Anunnaki is therefore a search for our own origins, our own potential, and our own place within a universe far older and more complex than recorded history acknowledges. As modern science advances, the mysteries once confined to clay tablets resurface in new forms. Genetic anomalies hint at forgotten chapters of human evolution. Archaeological discoveries reveal civilizations older and more advanced than expected. Astronomical alignments in ancient structures speak to a knowledge of the cosmos that should not have existed at the dawn of civilization. These findings do not prove the Anunnaki narrative, but they resonate with it, creating a bridge between myth and evidence, one that grows stronger with each new discovery. The greatest question, however, is not whether the Anunnaki were literal beings, lost teachers, or mythic constructs. It is whether humanity has reached the point at which the knowledge they left behind can finally be understood. The tablets insist that the me of civilization, the laws, arts, sciences, and mysteries, were gifts meant for a species capable of growth. If the Anunnaki withdrew, it may have been because we were not yet ready to wield the full extent of what they offered. But millennia have passed. We have mapped the heavens, split the atom, crossed the oceans, and encoded the genome. We have become creators in our own right. Perhaps the time has come for us to revisit the origins of our civilization, not with reverence, but with clarity. What the Sumerians preserved is not a closed chapter, but an open doorway. The forbidden truths hidden in their tablets invite us to question the boundaries of history, to see myth as encrypted memory, and to acknowledge that our ancestors may have known far more than we give them credit for. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, advanced beings, or symbolic representatives of lost knowledge, their legacy endures because it speaks to something fundamental within the human spirit: the need to understand where we came from and why our story began the way it did. As this journey concludes, we are left not with answers, but with awakened curiosity. The past is vast, fragmented, and often erased. Yet the fragments that survive, scratched into clay by hands long turned to dust, carry an invitation to look deeper, question boldly, and follow the forgotten pathways of early humanity. Somewhere within those fragments lies a truth that has waited for ages, a truth about who we were, who guided us, and what destiny might still lie ahead.